Two players walked into separate media sessions this week and stated the quiet part out loud. Michaela Timpson and Monique Billings didn't offer the carefully rehearsed, diplomatically sanitized answers the WNBA's established veteran hierarchy demands from younger players. They didn't hedge. They didn't qualify. They stated the observable, documented truth. This entire financial revolution belongs to one person, and behind closed locker room doors across the league, the old guard is incandescent with rage. For 18 consecutive months, the WNBA's established veterans coordinated a narrative with disciplined, almost militaristic precision. They appeared on podcasts. They posted carefully calibrated social media statements. They stood at podiums and delivered the unified message with practiced conviction. The game was always this great. You just weren't paying attention. What held that narrative together wasn't its accuracy. It was the enforced silence of every player who actually understood the real story. That silence just shattered, and the two voices that broke it in back-to-back media availabilities that have since lit up every WNBA fan space from Reddit to X just set the stage for one of the most consequential off-season narratives in recent league history. Understanding what they said, why it matters beyond the viral clip, and what the league's power structure is about to do in response, that's exactly where we're going today. If this unfiltered breakdown is why you keep coming back, hit that like button right now and let's get into it. To understand why Timpson's statement carries so much structural weight, you have to understand the internal sociology of a professional women's basketball locker room, specifically the hierarchy of obligation that governs how players speak in public spaces. The WNBA is, above almost everything else, a league built on earned sacrifice. The veterans who sustained this franchise through 2.5 decades of crushing financial subsidization, near minimum salaries, and zero mainstream media visibility didn't just play basketball. They carried the entire enterprise on their backs through sheer ideological commitment. That sacrifice created a cultural debt that shapes locker room dynamics to this day. The unwritten rule that emerged from that sacrifice is universally understood by every player who enters the league. You do not credit the success of the collective to any single individual, and you absolutely do not credit it to someone who arrived 18 months ago after the heavy institutional lifting was already done. Rookies and second-year players are aggressively conditioned to honor the pioneer generation. The required language is specific. Praise the players who built the foundation, credit the collective infrastructure, and frame everything happening right now as a natural evolution rather than a triggered disruption. Breaking that code publicly doesn't just create interpersonal friction, it creates career consequences. Michaela Timpson just broke that code in the most direct, unambiguous way imaginable. During a media availability that has since circulated broadly through WNBA fan communities, Timpson addressed the current explosive growth of the league without any of the expected diplomatic scaffolding. She didn't offer a carefully balanced acknowledgement of multiple contributors. She didn't invoke the pioneer generation. She stated plainly, and with evident conviction, that everything happening right now, the sold-out arenas, the primetime viewership, the economic transformation, exists because of Caitlin Clark, not as a contributing factor among many, as the singular cause. Understanding the political consequences of that statement requires situating it inside the most important financial event in the WNBA's 29-year history, the 2026 Collective Bargaining Agreement negotiations. The Players Association is currently engaged in the most consequential labor negotiation the league has ever seen, and the union's core argument at the negotiating table is structurally dependent on one premise: that the league's dramatic revenue increases were a collective achievement built by the entire player ecosystem, not attributable to any one individual. If the player's leverage position requires that framing to hold, and your own teammates are on record saying, "Actually, one person built this," that's an inconvenient fissure that team ownership will absolutely attempt to exploit. Not a fatal one, but a costly one. And in high-stakes CBA negotiations, costly is measured in contract language and revenue-sharing percentages. The veterans who have spent 2 years managing this narrative understand the CBA implications better than most outside analysts. That's a significant part of why the old guard's response to public Clark crediting has been consistently disproportionate to what looks on the surface, like a simple question of gratitude and respect. This isn't merely about ego. This is contract language being actively negotiated in conference rooms right now. When a player on your own side validates the argument your opponents are making at the bargaining table, the professional response is rarely gracious. Timpson made that statement knowing exactly what it costs a second-year player to say. She doesn't have 12 years of institutional capital to absorb the professional blowback. She still depends on veteran mentorship networks, locker room relationships, and the collective goodwill of the established player community to develop her career effectively. The conviction with which she delivered those words suggests she weighed the cost, understood it clearly, and accepted it anyway. That kind of deliberate honesty is extraordinarily rare at the early stage of a professional basketball career, and it deserves to be understood in that specific context rather than dismissed as naive enthusiasm. It's worth pausing to contextualize precisely what both players were tacitly acknowledging by speaking this truth publicly. The WNBA operated for 25 years in a condition of near-continuous financial subsidy. The NBA's commitment to sustaining the league was a long-term market development investment, not a charitable exercise. But for a quarter century, the on-court product, the level of individual talent on display, and the competitive intensity of the league remained fundamentally consistent with prior seasons. The mainstream audience needle barely moved. Attendance was stable but effectively stagnant. Broadcast deals reflected a modest niche product with a dedicated but limited reach. Then Caitlin Clark arrived within 18 months. The league negotiated a historic broadcast deal valued at dramatically higher multiples than any previous contract. Multiple franchises reported sold-out arenas for the first time in their histories. Sponsorship conversations that previously stalled at the proposal stage were suddenly progressing to signed agreements with brands that had never engaged with the WNBA at any meaningful level. The economics of the entire enterprise transformed at a velocity with no documented precedent in the league's history. Connecting those two data points, 25 years of plateau followed by an 18-month explosion, is not a sophisticated analytical challenge. The timing correlation is so stark it borders on impossible to dispute rationally. What Timpson and Billings did is refuse to pretend the correlation doesn't exist. For fans who have watched this dynamic unfold in real time and been systematically gaslit about it, that refusal is genuinely significant. The WNBA's fan community has been documenting exactly this dynamic across the entire offseason. On X, Reddit, and dedicated basketball forums, followers of the league have tracked every instance of veteran players deflecting questions about Clark's economic contribution with carefully calibrated strategic ambiguity, and contrasted those deflections against Timpson's directness. The gap between those two postures produces a visible, measurable authenticity differential that resonates with general sports audiences far beyond the WNBA's core fanbase. Multiple analysts covering the league noted that Timpson's media session clip generated more organic positive engagement from non-dedicated WNBA viewers than virtually any other preseason media moment. That tells you something important about the distance between the official narrative that certain factions within the league are actively maintaining, and the reality that most casual sports observers have already independently concluded. The loudest voices enforcing that narrative are not the ones with the most credibility left to spend. What makes this week's revelations genuinely explosive in their analytical depth, though, isn't Timpson's political courage alone, it's the tactical significance of what Monique Billings disclosed in her own press conference, because buried inside her free agency availability is a piece of information that every Indiana Fever fan heading into 2026 absolutely needs to understand in full. Before we break down exactly what Billings revealed, because it is more analytically significant than anything else said this entire offseason, drop a comment right now. Do you think Timpson's public statement will generate real professional consequences from the veteran establishment this season? Or does playing for the Indiana Fever provide enough institutional insulation to protect her from the worst of the blowback? I genuinely want to know where you stand on this one as we go deeper. Monique Billings entered this offseason as one of the most sought-after free agents on the market. Multiple contending franchises with legitimate playoff aspirations were actively competing for her services. She had options, she had leverage, and she had the professional track record to be deliberately selective. When reporters asked her to walk through the specific decision-making process, what ultimately tipped the scales toward Indiana, she bypassed the diplomatic template entirely. She cited two direct basketball relationships: her time playing alongside Kelsey Mitchell in the unrivaled league, and her highly productive time sharing the floor with Caitlin Clark on Team USA. That is not a crafted PR narrative for public consumption. That is a professional athlete explaining in honest and direct terms exactly how she evaluated one of the most consequential career decisions available to her. And the implication of what she's describing is as significant as anything else said this entire offseason. A veteran professional with genuine leverage and multiple options chose her destination primarily because she had already experienced what it feels like to operate alongside the greatest offensive engine in the history of women's basketball, and she actively wanted a full season of it. This statement functionally dismantles a specific media narrative that circulated heavily throughout Clark's rookie season. The suggestion that established veteran players resist sharing a roster with a ball-dominant, media-centric star because it limits their own statistical opportunities and individual spotlight. Billings' documented decision-making process directly contradicts that framing at every level. Players operating at an elite professional level, the ones genuinely prioritizing field goal efficiency, career longevity, and legitimate championship pursuit over personal visibility metrics, are not avoiding Caitlin Clark. They are actively choosing her. That distinction matters enormously for how we understand the power dynamics inside the current WNBA ecosystem. There is a second dimension to Billings' Team USA experience that carries highly practical implications for the Fever's 2026 season, one that has received almost no serious analytical attention. During Clark's rookie campaign, one of the most consistently identified structural vulnerabilities in Indiana's offense was what could be diplomatically described as a processing speed mismatch. Veteran players, talented, experienced, and well-intentioned, were routinely unprepared for passes arriving through windows so narrow they barely appeared to exist in the real-time geometry of the play. Ball handlers who had spent careers learning to read offensive tempo at a certain calibrated pace were simply not internally adjusted for how quickly Clark processes court geometry and executes the distribution decision. The results were documented repeatedly in the box score, and on film, fumbles at critical transition moments, layups contested, that should have been uncontested, and visible frustration when clean looks deteriorated into turnovers, because the receiver's timing was a half-beat behind the pass. Monique Billings has already solved that specific problem before stepping into a single regular season practice with Indiana. She experienced that exact offensive tempo firsthand during Team USA preparation. Her body has already internally calibrated to the pace at which the ball moves through Clark's processing cycle. She doesn't arrive in Indianapolis needing a season to develop the anticipatory skill required. She arrives already synchronized, and that specific practical advantage deserves far more analytical attention than it has received in the mainstream coverage of her signing. Now, the single most analytically important disclosure from Billings' entire offseason media availability, and the one that most mainstream coverage treated as a minor throwaway quote. When reporters asked her about operating in pick-and-roll actions with elite guards, Billings responded with explicit and genuine enthusiasm. She loves setting a good screen, she loves creating space for her guards, and she loves being physically rewarded for the commitment that effective screening requires. If you watch the Indiana Fever's 2024 season in analytical detail, you understand exactly why those words carry more meaningful weight than almost anything else said this entire offseason. The physical screen setting for Caitlin Clark last season was, at its most structurally honest assessment, a persistent liability. Multiple forwards in the rotation were routinely observed slipping off ball screens prematurely, positioning themselves for their own shot opportunity before the screening action was completed, which effectively abandoned the primary tactical assignment at its most critical moment. Others set screens generating contact so minimal they produced no functional defensive displacement. The cumulative result compounded across an entire season. The most lethal long-distance shooter in the history of women's basketball was repeatedly asked to create her own separation against defenders who, had the screen been physically committed, would have had no viable recovery path. The mathematics are straightforward and brutal. Give Caitlin Clark 12 inches of daylight coming off a properly set high ball screen, and the possession is functionally over for the opposing defense before the ball has left her hands. That 12 inches requires a screener willing to absorb physical contact, set her feet early enough to establish legal position, and subordinate her own statistical ambitions entirely to the geometry of the spacing. Billings is describing exactly that commitment, and she's describing it with genuine enthusiasm, not as a professional obligation she accepts reluctantly, but as the specific role she actively enjoys filling. That psychological alignment between player identity and tactical assignment is extraordinarily rare and functionally impossible to manufacture through coaching instruction alone. And if this level of deep analytical breakdown is the reason you keep finding your way back to this channel, consider joining as a member by hitting that join button below. Your support is what makes it possible to keep running this level of research and coverage consistently week after week. Now we arrive at the question that almost no mainstream coverage of the Indiana Fever is willing to ask directly, because all of the above, Timpson's political truth-telling, Billings' tactical fit, the offensive geometry. This roster can theoretically construct around number 22, is entirely contingent on one variable that remains genuinely uncertain heading into 2026. Stephanie White. Let us be analytically fair about what White brings to this organization. Her defensive tenure with the Connecticut Sun was exceptional by any objective measure. She built a physically imposing, intellectually disciplined defensive unit that consistently frustrated opposing offenses across multiple playoff series. Her understanding of help rotations, weak side accountability, and defensive scheme complexity is as sophisticated as anything in the current WNBA coaching landscape. The fever, which bled points in transition and missed defensive rotations at costly rates throughout last season, legitimately needed that level of defensive credibility on the sideline. The analytical tension is not what White builds defensively. The tension is what her coaching philosophy has historically demanded on offense. Her most successful systems were built around structural predictability, a controlled half-court pace, clearly defined spacing assignments, and an offensive framework in which the head coach's design play action holds primary authority over individual improvisation in the moment. That system worked beautifully with the personnel she had available in Connecticut. The question is whether that same instinct applies to an entirely different kind of player. Caitlin Clark is not that personnel. She is not a player who executes most effectively within a predetermined, structure-first offensive framework. She is the framework itself. Her value is generated precisely by the freedom to read defensive positioning in real time and attack whatever the geometry of the defense provides in the specific moment, not by executing the action drawn up during the timeout with discipline and organizational precision. Structural constraint applied to that process doesn't refine it. It systematically removes its most dangerous qualities, which are fluidity, unpredictability, and the instinctual decision-making speed that makes her impossible to scheme against when she is operating freely. Monique Billings, for what it's worth, praised White's energy and passion in her press conference. That tells you White's competitive intensity reads positively in the locker room environment. But energy and tactical flexibility are genuinely different qualities, and the distinction matters at the highest level of playoff competition.